Hi, I'm Chris from CodeReviewVideos.com, and in this video we're going to get started working towards a test-driven wallpaper delete process. As we already have a reference implementation, this being the code that we had at the end of video 31, where we implemented wallpaper delete in an untested fashion, we're going to refer back to this to figure out what we need to do and what we might need to test. I'm going to start by adding the tag for pre-remove to our wallpaper listener service definition. This is pretty much just a case of duplicating a line and changing the event to pre-remove. We have no way to directly test this step, so it's really easy to forget to do. That's why I'm doing it up front. And now that we've tagged our wallpaper listener service to listen out for pre-remove events, let's take a look at the implementation that we have for pre-remove. So as it stands, there will be two paths that we care about through this code. The first path will be the happy path, where a call to event args get entity returns a wallpaper, which gets us past this guard statement. Onto that wallpaper, we want to set the file to be null. This is just a bit of housekeeping, and the real process of deleting a file gets passed off to our file deleter service. We're also going to need to implement our file deleter service again, and we'll need to write tests for that too. Then the other path through our code is what happens if event args get entity returns something that isn't a wallpaper, which in our case will just fake off to be an instance of category. And so what we expect there is to trigger this guard statement. So let's add this new information into our test suite. We're going to add in a new test. So we'll set this up to be called it can pre-remove. So we know at some point this pre-remove is going to get called. And if we take a look at our implementation, you can see that when we call pre-remove, or rather when Doctrine dispatches a pre-remove event, our listener is going to get called with an instance of lifecycle event args. So I'm just going to take a copy of that, paste this in. And even though we don't own this, I'm still going to start off by trying to mock it all the same, as we've done so similarly in existing tests without any issue. So if we've got our event args, we can pass that in and we should be good. Now, as we're on the happy path here, when we hit the guard statement, we're going to expect to be dealing with a wallpaper. So I'm going to say on our event args, when get entity is called, I want to return an instance of wallpaper. Now we could either new one up, or we could get PHP spec to mock it for us. So I'm going to get PHP spec to mock an instance of wallpaper for us. So scroll that up there a little bit. I'll say wallpaper, it's wallpaper. And then again, let's take a look at our implementation to know what we need to do next. So there's a few things that we should expect to happen. We're going to expect a call to set file with the argument of null. And we're also going to call this file deleter delete with the outcome of entity get file name. So we'll start off by defining what should happen when entity get file name is called. So our entity is a wallpaper, and get file name is a method on that wallpaper. And when that's called, we'll say we'll return a fake file name .jpg. Now after this pre-remove has been called, we would also want to check that that file deleter, which we don't yet have as a property of our wallpaper listener spec, should have had its delete method called with our fake file name, because that's the outcome of a call to wallpaper get file name. And we can say here should have been called, because that's after the fact. In other words, after the pre-remove process has gone through, we should expect that the file deleter has deleted the expected file. Now we also know that after the fact, our wallpaper set file with an argument of null should also have been called. So let's add that in as well. So we'll say set file with null should have been called. Now this line, this wallpaper set file null should have been called, will not actually work as we expect, but I'm going to leave it in there anyway because it's going to highlight a problem that you may come across when working with PHP spec. But all the same, let's try and run these tests now. So we're trying to call pre-remove on our wallpaper listener. PHP spec is rightfully telling us that it doesn't exist. It's going to say yes, I want it to create that method for me. And then it's rerun the test through and it's saying, yep, we can find the pre-remove method now, but the file deleter property doesn't exist. So there's two approaches we can take here. We can either fake out our file deleter and continue on with this test, or we can use this as a cue to go ahead and work on our file deleter first. I'm going to take the second approach, as that makes more sense in my head. So I'm going to clear this off here, and I'm going to get started by describing a spec for our local file system file deleter. And I'm going to immediately run that spec and let PHP spec take care of creating that file for me. And then I'll go ahead and open up both the spec and the implementation inside PHP Storm. The first thing that I want to do inside our local file system file deleter spec is update the initializable test to ensure that we implement the expected interface. Now that interface doesn't exist as of yet. At this stage we're pretty much just creating stuff out of thin air. So let's just check what PHP spec thinks if we try and run this test now. We can see here that we expected an instance of spec / and then the rest of the path, and that's interesting because as this interface doesn't exist and we've just typed this in, there's no appropriate use statement for it, so it's just going to the local directory, and that's why it thinks we're inside the spec namespace. Let's not worry about that too much. Let's just go ahead and create the expected interface. I'm just going to create it under the service directory, so in here I'll just create a new file which I'll call the file deleter. I'll just close down that pane at the moment as I'm at a real premium for screen real estate in this mode. So we'll move to the opposite group. Yes, we'll add it to Git, that doesn't really matter. And then we're just going to fill this in. So we'll be in the namespace of @bundle service. We're defining an interface called file deleter. This interface has one public function, which we're going to call delete, which will take one argument, which is a string, which will be our path to our file. So now we should be able to go back in here, take the R off the end, try again. Now PHP Storm is able to pick up on the fact that that is a real file, gets the right use statement in there. And if we run our test, we've still got a fail, but you can see this time we're expecting to be an instance of at least the right interface. So for our local file system file deleter, we can now implement file deleter, which is going to prompt us to implement that method. So it's Command and N on a Mac to implement whatever methods were outstanding. That should be good. And this time we are in a passing state. So let's take a look at what we expect our local file system file deleter to actually do. And for this we'll refer to our prototype implementation. So we can see we're passing in two arguments to our constructor. The first is Symfony's file system, and the second is a string which will serve as the base file path to any image that exists on our local file system. In other words, there will be like a hard-coded base path for which we'll make use of Symfony's kernel.root dir or kernel project dir, depending on which version of Symfony you're using. And then we're going to concatenate that with whatever path is passed in to the delete function in order to determine the real path of the file to delete. So let's go ahead and put this knowledge into our test for our local file system file deleter. So we're going to create a test called itCanDelete, and inside this test we're going to try and delete a path to a file, and after we've called this delete with that file path, we should expect on the file system the remove call to have been made. And remember here we swapped using remove because that's the method on Symfony's file system component that we will actually be calling, and we'll say that should have been called. So let's attempt to run our tests now and see where we get. I'm just going to clear that off, up arrow to bring our test back, and you can see property file system not found, and that's on the local file system file deleter. And that's true because our local file system file deleter doesn't have a constructor, so we're not passing in any of these arguments as of yet. So we can get PHP spec to help us here by using the let method. And what we'll do here is we'll pass in a mock of Symfony's file system, which again we don't own, but we'll start off by trying to mock it and only adapt our process if we can't get further with that mock. And secondly, we'll need to pass in that base file path, which in our case is going to be /expected/path. And as you can see in itCanDelete, we should expect that path to be concatenated with whatever file path we pass in. Now again, we can try running our tests. This time, because we've got that let function in place, PHP spec knows that we should have a constructor, which it's seen that we don't have currently inside our local file system file deleter implementation. So it's asking us if we'd like to create one, and I'm going to say yes. But we'll still need to do a bit of tidy up here. So I'm going to cheat a touch, and I'm going to borrow / completely steal the implementation that we've already got, because there's no point typing more stuff in than I have to. Just take a copy of that full class and paste this in here. And at this stage you may rightly be thinking that this entire test should now be passing, as we have an implementation that we know works. So let's see where we get. I'll just clear that off and try this again. And you can see still this property of file system is not found. Now this is a little bit weird because we do now have a property called file system, so what on earth is going on? So it doesn't actually relate to our actual implementation here. This is a problem with our test. What we're trying to do is access this file system inside our itCanDelete function, and this file system is not a property of our local file system file deleter spec, or to put it another way, it's not a property of this class. So fixing this is pretty straightforward, honestly. PHP Storm won't be nice enough to give us any help here, but we can do a private class property of file system, which now PHP Storm is a little bit happier about, but we also need to make sure that whatever we're mocking as our file system, we are setting onto that local class property. So let's see where we get with that. Okay, so we're flagging up an issue here where we've got this double slash, and this was something that we've already covered in this project, and it's something that we'll cover again in the final video in this series, as I'm not entirely happy with the way that this service definitions and so on are now set up. Let's see if that fixes it. Try again. We're looking good this time. So really the only thing that's left to do at this stage is to set up the service definition for our file deleter. So under services, just close this down now, maybe stretch this out just a touch. We'll add in a service definition for our app service local file system file deleter. That's going to have a class of app bundle service local file system file deleter. It's going to take these two arguments as we've seen in our test. We'll need Symfony's file system component, which is already defined for us as a service by Symfony. It's just at file system. And then we'll also need a path to where our images will live, which in our case is going to be the kernel.root dir because we're in Symfony 3.2, and then upper directory as we've already covered in this series, and then into the web images directory.